Swimming Lessons by Lupin. Read by Emerald Lupin. Chapter 2. And You Can Get Her to Swim. Celestia rubbed her temples, feeling the onset of a headache. One spell, one inordinately powerful freezing spell, was all it took to cause this much damage. On an isolated body of water, this wouldn't have been an issue, but the pool wasn't just a simple hole in the ground. It had a pump, which not only circulated and cleaned the pool water, but was also connected to the main water line, so any lost water could be replaced. Thanks to the excessive amount of power involved, the spell hadn't stopped at just the pool itself. It had created a chain reaction that reached the pump before spreading to water lines throughout the castle. Of course, water expands when solid, and as any pony who lived in cold climates would have told you, rapidly expanding ice inside a frozen pipe will often cause it to burst. And the pipes had certainly burst. They burst like a bunch of balloons surrounded by cacti in a room with a breeze. The damage was extensive. 2 whole wings had lost access to running water, along with a few other scattered sections of the castle. And as she learned later during the damage assessment, a few sewage lines had been broken as well. Celestia was sure they must have summoned every plumber in Canterlot to deal with the mess, and a portion of her guards had to be diverted in order to break down the gigantic block that had once been the contents of her swimming pool. And then there was the collateral damage. Walls had taken water damage, or had needed to be cut open in order to reach the broken plumbing. Rugs and carpets had been totally soaked and needed drying. Wood furniture, documents, and other assorted things within reach had all taken some damage from the floodwater. "It's going to take quite a few bits to cover the damages," said Supply Curve, her new economic advisor. He was barely 20 years old, but highly skilled nonetheless. The Pegasus's wings flapped in irritation. Telling the cost of this disaster had not put him in a good mood. "I'd also recommend adjusting the castle and maintenance repair portion of the budget, just to cover any future incidents like this. Of course, that will require another meeting with the rest of the advisors." Celestia sighed heavily. She'd just had a meeting a couple days ago. "I'll have Kibitz added to the schedule," she said reluctantly. Yet another thing to deal with during the heat wave. "You may go now, Supply Curve." The Pegasus left her chambers with a bow, and as soon as he did, Celestia heard the shuffle of tiny hooves behind her. "I'm sorry," said Sunset quietly as she came out of hiding, barely able to look at her mentor. "I didn't mean to break all that stuff." "I know you didn't," consoled Celestia, willing the ache in her skull to disappear. "And I'm not punishing you for it. But Sunset, you should be careful when you're putting that much power into a spell. That's part of the reason it caused as much damage as it did." "Yes, Princess," muttered the filly. Her head shot up, eagerness reigniting. "Can we stop the swimming lessons now? If I'm real careful, I can use magic to keep safe, right?" Celestia shook her head. "I'm afraid not." "But why?" whined the filly. "I wouldn't fall in the water if it was frozen, and I could get out that way too, couldn't I?" "Freezing the water like that can be dangerous," replied Celestia. "What if it wasn't a pool? What if it had life in it? You'd freeze them solid. And if you were in the water, wouldn't you freeze yourself as well?" The filly looked taken aback. Clearly, she hadn't thought that far ahead. Celestia placed a hoof on her tiny shoulder. "There may be times where you'll be unable to use your magic, or unable to concentrate. I want you to be prepared, Sunset, and that means learning to do some things without relying on your magic. Swimming is one of those things." "But Princess," Sunset began to argue. "Let me ask you a question, my student," interrupted Celestia. "What if you knew how to levitate yourself?" The filly's excitement returned. "You can do that? Can you show me? Please?" Celestia's hoof pressed down to steady her. "Not right now, no. That will be much further down the road, when your magic is more developed. But what if you could?" repeated Celestia, ignoring Sunset's disappointment. "Would that mean you wouldn't have to know how to walk?" The filly bit her lip. Or what about Pegasi? Do they not need to learn how to walk simply because they can fly?" The filly stood silent, and Celestia knew she'd won. "You see the point I'm making, don't you, Sunset?" The little unicorn gave a huff, but nodded her head. Yes, Princess Celestia. Celestia pulled the filly closer with one of her great white wings. I know you're having problems, but you'll get past this, I promise. Although, since the castle pool is out of operation, we'll need a new place to practice. They ended up in the castle gardens. While not having a proper pool, the gardens did have a multitude of ponds that were deep enough to swim in. True to her word, Celestia had gotten Sunset a new flotation ring, this one from a much more reliable manufacturer. Unlike the one before, this ring fit properly, and while Celestia was certain Sunset wouldn't need it for very long, she'd had it decorated with red and gold waves as an extra personal touch. Best of all, it held up against pressure, as a quick test had proven. After the way things had begun yesterday, Celestia considered this new ring to be something of a good omen. Help! Though not good enough, it seemed. This was Sunset's fourth attempt today at swimming. Sunset, you need to relax, said the princess as soothingly as she could, and not for the first time today. Panicking like that won't do you any good. But I'm sinking, cried the little unicorn as she flailed in the water, trying to grab onto her brand-new flotation ring. Sighing, Celestia pulled her student and the flotation ring back to shore. Well, you certainly stayed up longer this time, she said, trying to console the wet and clearly unhappy filly. Returning both Sunset and the ring to the ground, Celestia went over to a smaller, neighboring pond. I think it's time we work on something slightly different, said the princess, suppressing her own frustration. Opening up the small box she'd brought with her, she took out 3 metal cubes, holding them over the water in her magic. Sunset looked up, fixing her mentor with a perplexed stare. Aren't those the levitation weights you had me practice with? They are indeed. Items like these were common in Equestria. Rather than simple toy blocks, these were training weights for young unicorns, used to practice and strengthen levitation. These in particular belonged to a slightly heavier tier. But I can already lift those, declared Sunset. Taking them in her magic, she lifted them high into the sky to prove her point. I know that, Sunset, answered Celestia gently, taking the blocks back in her own magical aura. That's part of the point. This time you'll be lifting them from the bottom of the pond. Sunset frowned. The bottom? Celestia nodded, pulling out a blindfold. Hold still while I put this on. Sunset obeyed, and once Celestia was sure her eyes were covered, she dropped the blocks into the water, finding a moderate depth that was perfect for this sort of exercise. Pressing them into the dirt, she moved the terrain around to obscure them from surface view. With that finished, she took off the blindfold. The filly looked around. Where'd they go? Celestia chuckled. I'm afraid that's what you're going to have to figure out. One of the things I noticed during your attempts yesterday and today is that you don't open your eyes under the water. I'd like you to work on that, as well as get more practice moving through the water itself. What I want you to do now is dive down and look for them. When you find them, you'll then bring them back to me. It can be all at once or one at a time. There's no rush. But in order to find them, you'll have to open your eyes. And remember, I'll be right here if you need help. Sunset didn't look thrilled, but nodded her head in compliance. Okay. Without needing to be told, she went into the pond, taking a deep breath and descending beneath the surface. Celestia watched Sunset's form carefully from her position on shore. So far, she was moving well enough, if slowly and unsteadily. But in this case, her student's problem of sinking didn't factor in. This particular pond was shallower than its neighbor, barely deep enough for Sunset's whole body to dip below the surface, so rising to take a breath was easy. From what she could tell, Sunset's eyes were open sometimes, which was good. But they never seemed to stay open for very long, and on the whole they remained firmly shut. It made her search all the more difficult, reducing her to pawing blindly at the dirt with her hooves. Celestia frowned, but reminded herself that her student wasn't used to the sensation of water on her eyes yet. She'd surely get used to it eventually. If this went well enough, they could even repeat this as a timed exercise. And maybe, just maybe, these shallow dives would help Sunset stop panicking the moment she started sinking even a fraction of an inch. Finally, the unicorn found the spot where Celestia had dropped the weights. The princess saw her horn light up, and all 3 blocks floated their way to the surface, with Sunset's head and body following soon after. "Princess, I got them!" she declared. She shook her head, flinging off some of the moisture that clung to her face. "I got all 3 of them and—" "Huh?" Celestia quirked an eyebrow. "What's wrong, Sunset?" "My tail's heavy." Sunset looked backwards, lifting her tail out of the water. There, attached to the last inch of those red and gold strands, was a lime-green fish with big, bulbous eyes. Sunset screamed, shaking her tail to dislodge the creature. "Get off of me!" She tugged at the fish with a levitation spell, but it refused to relinquish its grip. "Get off! You can't eat my tail!" She pulled even harder, but the fish refused to obey. "Let go, let go, let go!" "Sunset, calm down. Fine, take this!" Like the day before, Sunset's magic went off before Celestia could stop it. There was a bright flash combined with a boom, and the princess was forced to shield her eyes with a wing. "When did she learn how to cast a stun spell?" She heard a series of thumps followed by a splash. When Celestia pulled her wing away, she found her student unconscious in the pond, the weights having fallen back down. The offending fish was belly up in the water, lost in a daze along with many of its brethren. In fact, it looked like the entire population of the pond as more and more fish floated lifelessly to the surface. Celestia rushed over to the filly, picking her up. Sunset let out a groan in response. There were a few bruises forming on her back, probably from the blocks landing on her if Celestia had to guess. The marks were small. Thankfully, Sunset hadn't been holding them too far above her head. Sighing in relief, Celestia retrieved the weights and went on her way back to the castle. She made a mental note to ask Sunset where and when she'd learned how to cast a stun spell. Sunset had met and talked with a few of the professors at Celestia's school, but Celestia highly doubted they were responsible. None of them were foolish enough to teach such a thing to a filly, even if they were her personal student. She'd have to talk with Sunset about using it, not to mention yet another discussion over power modulation. But first, a trip to the royal physician was in order. She doubted anything was broken, but it was better to be safe than sorry. The princess sighed again, a heavier, wearier breath. Another day, another setback. It was mid-morning the next day, and Sunset Shimmer sat on the plush carpet of her room in Canterlot Castle. Her room was spacious, as was expected considering where she lived. There were 2 sets of tall, dark wooden bookshelves, already half filled with books, mostly magical and academic in nature, with some novels and picture books mixed in. A large writing desk had been provided for her homework, perched in a corner by the window. Odds and ends of simple experiments were left in various spots on the floor, while a few small toys lay on top of a low but ornate wooden dresser, though there were several more locked tightly in a little chest in the back of her moderately sized closet. The bed was queen-sized, with a dark red comforter set atop white sheets and several pillows, more than enough for a single filly. A book on magic sat before the unicorn, pages turning idly in a shimmering glow. She'd read this one before, words blurring before her eyes. Her teacher's lectures from yesterday were still ringing in her ears, along with the several pointed questions Sunset had been asked regarding her spell. She didn't know she wasn't supposed to learn that yet, and it wasn't her fault that the book had been misfiled. Sunset had simply been hoping to surprise Celestia with that spell, to show her teacher the fruits of her extra studying. Well, Celestia had definitely been surprised, but the results were far from what Sunset had been hoping for. As she turned another page, there was a knock at the door. "Come in." The door opened in a golden glow, and Princess Celestia walked in. "Good morning, Sunset," she said with a smile. "I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you for breakfast this morning, but since I'm free at the moment, I thought we could begin your lessons for the day. Follow me." The filly set down her book, mentally crossing her forelegs that it would be something other than swimming today. Her wish seemed to be granted when the pair stopped at the door to Celestia's suite. They went inside, and Sunset took a moment to bask in it. There was a warmth to the Sun Princess's chambers, much like its owner. Looking around, she noted the absence of Philomena. The phoenix was usually off flying at this time of day. "This way," said Celestia. Sunset snapped to attention, following the alicorn to a door she'd never been to before. Sunset had only ever been inside the main room, and Celestia's bedroom once or twice. Was this some sort of special study? Sunset's steps quickened with eagerness. If Celestia had a magical study, it was bound to have all sorts of amazing things. The door opened, and Sunset found herself faced with a bathroom. It was a much larger and more ornate bathroom than the one Sunset used. Things had always seemed high up to her in there, but here they were practically towering. There was a large mirror that spanned half the wall on one side, underneath which was a long countertop made of gleaming marble, as well as a gilded faucet for the sink. If she'd been high enough, she would have seen the various hygiene and grooming tools neatly laid out over the surface. On the other side of the room was a large marble bathtub, also sporting a gilded faucet. Hanging on a nearby bar was a pair of dove-white cotton towels embroidered with Celestia's cutie mark. In addition, there were shelves underneath the countertop for even more towels of various sizes. "This is my private bathroom, Sunset," said Celestia, answering the filly's unspoken question. "Your bathroom?" replied the unicorn with disappointment. Why were they in her bathroom? Did the princess still need to brush her teeth or something? The filly's eyes widened. "Are your teeth really rotting away?" Celestia was taken aback. "What? No, Sunset, of course not." She raised an eyebrow. "What gave you that idea?" "One of the guards," answered the filly. "I heard him say that you eat so many sweets, your teeth would rot away in a month." She hadn't really meant to overhear him, but he'd been so loud that it had been impossible to ignore him. "I didn't believe him," she added quickly, noticing the way her mentor's jaw clenched. Celestia's expression immediately softened. "As you should, my faithful student. I take very good care of my teeth, and I hope you are as well." The princess paused. "You are doing everything Dr. Pearlywhite's told you to do, correct?" she asked, referring to the Pegasus mare employed as the royal dentist. "Uh-huh," nodded Sunset, opening her mouth wide to illustrate the point. "Good. Now tell me," the princess's expression turned to something more serious, "what was the name of this guard that told you my teeth were going to rot?" "Javelin throw," answered the unicorn. "I think he's new," she added helpfully, remembering the conversation she'd picked up. Celestia hummed for a moment, muttering something about a week and barracks latrine duty, before turning her attention back to Sunset. "In any event, the reason we're here is to continue your swimming lessons." Sunset's face fell. "More swimming? I should have wished harder." Celestia patted her student's back with a wing. "More swimming. But don't worry, today will go differently than the others." She gave the unicorn a gentle smile. "Now, I know the last couple days have had their issues, but today we'll be focusing on something else." The princess turned the handle on the tub faucet, letting the water rush in. Sunset tilted her head. "You want me to use your bathtub?" Sure, it was huge, big enough to fit Princess Celestia and then some. In fact, it looked large enough to fit 3 full-grown ponies. But it didn't seem like the right size to swim in, not like the pond or the pool. Celestia nodded. "You're going to be learning to float today." She levitated a long back brush and placed it over the middle of the tub, anchoring the ends with her magic before lifting Sunset into the water. "Hold on to that for me." The unicorn did as she was told, quickly hooking her forelegs around the plastic brush as the water level continued to rise. Once it was high enough, Celestia shut off the faucet before smiling down at her student. "I want you to try and lay flat on your stomach while holding onto the brush. Let your hind legs float out behind you. Yes, just like that." Sunset let her legs float, feeling the water slosh around her neck and chin as she tried to keep her head above it. Her grip around the brush tightened, and every muscle in her little body went as rigid as stone. She actually wasn't a stranger to tubs this large, not since staying with Celestia. But as she lay there floating in the water, all her memories of the last 2 days came back to the forefront of her brain. Her grip grew even tighter. "Floating is quite simple, Sunset. Simple and easy to master," Celestia said, not noticing her student's tension. "It is especially important because it can allow you to keep safe if you're ever at a depth you can't manage, or if you're unable to fully swim for whatever reason." She double-checked the magic anchoring the brush handle. "We'll start with floating on your stomach, and then move to floating on your back. Celestia leaned in closer. Are you ready to try? Sunset looked up at her mentor, her little heart racing in her chest. A large part of her wanted to say no right then and there, but even still, she nodded her head. Her mentor was looking at her expectantly, and Sunset felt like saying no would have been letting the princess down. Besides, Princess Celestia said floating was easy. Simple and easy. All right, on the count of 3, I want you to let go. 1, 2, 3. Sunset let go of the brush and immediately sank. Help! Gurgled the filly as her mouth dipped below the surface. Her legs flailed wildly, sending water sloshing over the side of the tub, even as her magic reached out to grab the brush handle. Sunset, please, you need to relax and... Celestia started to say, before a well-aimed wave slapped her in the face. Having just pulled her head from the water via her magic, Sunset froze, horrified at splashing her mentor yet again. I'm sorry! The Princess of the Sun spat out the water in a rather undignified fashion. It's all right, my student. I know you didn't mean it. Celestia glanced around, looking at the mass of puddles on the tiled floor, before pulling out several towels from under the countertop to cover them. Let's try again. And they did, 2 more times. Both resulted in the same thing. Sunset's forelegs practically shook as she held onto the back brush. I'm sorry, she repeated. Celestia dabbed her face with a hoof towel, eyeing the distinct drop in the tub's waterline. Let's refill the tub and try again. And please, Sunset, try to relax. As Celestia turned on the faucet, Sunset breathed deep, trying to relax. In and out, in and out. This was easy, right? Simple and easy. Sunset repeated those words to herself, letting them bolster her emotions as her heart began to slow down. She could do this. She could float. And once she did, maybe she'd get the hang of swimming too. Maybe. Her growing sense of calm died when the sensation of the new water hit her hind legs. Cold water. No, not just cold. Ice cold. Sunset yelped, letting go of the brush and clamoring to get out of the tub. The sides were too thick to hook her stubby forelegs over. Sunset, what's the matter? Asked the startled Princess Celestia. It's freezing! Cried the filly, still trying to pull herself out. Her teeth were beginning to chatter. Princess Celestia, the water's freezing! Celestia blinked. What? She grabbed the unicorn in her magic and lifted her out and onto the bath mat. Placing a hoof under the running water, she immediately pulled it back. That should be hot. There came a knocking sound from beyond the bathroom. Celestia turned to Sunset. Wait here. Celestia trotted off, leaving Sunset to sit there, dripping and shivering in place. The water had been so cold, cold like the river. In the distance, she picked up Kibbit's voice. Your Majesty, Why are you wet? It doesn't matter, Kibbits. What's going on? The stallion's voice took on a distinctly annoyed edge. I'm sorry to inform you, Your Majesty, but the plumbers had to shut off the hot water to this section of the castle. Apparently it was unavoidable and will have to be off for several hours. I see, replied Celestia, a trace of stiffness in her tone. Thank you for informing me, Kibbits. Celestia returned to the bathroom, her face impassive. Sunset, I'm afraid there is no hot water, completed the filly dismally. I heard Mr. Kibbits. She shivered again. Princess? Her voice was small and pleading. Can we stop for now? Sunset, I could just use magic and heat. Please? She shivered again, wiping some droplets from the end of her nose with a hoof, coming away with globs of mucus in the process. All right, my faithful student, Celestia said gently. Picking up the large white towels in her magic, she wrapped them around Sunset. Let's get you warm and dry, and once you are, we'll begin a lesson on transfiguration. Would you like that? Uh-huh, nodded the filly, though inside she didn't feel quite as enthused as she normally would. It was like the cold water had taken something out of her besides body heat. As the pair walked out of the bathroom, a A single thought passed through her head. This was supposed to be simple and easy. Sunset Shimmer walked back to her room, having finished her breakfast. Like yesterday, Princess Celestia had business early this morning, which meant Sunset had time to herself yet again. The lesson in Transfiguration had gone fairly well, though Celestia had only had time to give her an overview and do a few practical demonstrations before she got pulled away to a meeting. That would have been disappointing enough, but what made it worse for Sunset was that the meeting was with the royal advisors, the meeting Sunset was responsible for. Knowing that had just increased the filly's dejected mood, and that feeling had carried through to today. After the meeting ended, Celestia had returned to give Sunset another lecture. This time, the subject was on swimmer's safety. The princess had even composed a test on it, which she'd left inside a pair of saddlebags this morning in the dining hall, along with a few non-swimming related assignments, all of which were meant to be finished by this afternoon. As Sunset trotted down the halls, she picked up on a pair of voices. Then 2 mares came into view. The first one she recognized as Tea-Tray, the head maid. Tea-Tray was a saucer-eyed earth pony mare, one that Sunset had come to like. She had a cream-colored coat, though that was mostly obscured by her dark uniform, a long spring green mane that she usually tied back into a bun, and a serving tray cutie mark. She directed the other maids of the castle with practiced authority and professionalism, always making sure they were doing their jobs properly, but came off as friendly and cordial otherwise, always greeting the princess and Sunset with an open, inviting expression. At the moment, she had several towels and brushes resting on her back, a mop draped across her broad shoulders, and an empty bucket dangling from her tail. The handle of a cart, filled to the brim with other cleaning tools, was secured in her mouth. The other mare, a Pegasus, was walking in step beside her. She was younger, with a white coat and blue eyes. Her mane was also spring green, like Tea-Tray's, but cut rather short and brushed to the side in a cultish sort of way. Her cutie mark appeared to be some kind of fancy cup. "You should take some time off work, Tea," the younger mare was saying. "You work too long as it is." "I can't, Porcelain, you know that," replied Tea-Tray as she let go of the cart handle. Her words sounded rehearsed, like they'd had this argument many times before. "This castle requires a great deal of upkeep." The Pegasus rolled her eyes. "You also can't be taking all that stuff by yourself." Grabbing the bucket from Tea-Tray's tail, she placed it on her own. She seemed to contemplate taking something else when she glanced back and noticed Sunset standing there. "Hey, kiddo!" She waved a foreleg energetically. "Mind lending us a hoof?" Tea-Tray's powder blue eyes, barely covered by the frames of her glasses, followed the younger mare's gaze. "Hello, Miss Shimmer. Porcelain, this is Sunset Shimmer. She's Princess Celestia's new student." The Pegasus turned to Tea-Tray in surprise. "Really?" Gliding over to Sunset, she looked down at the filly in curiosity and wonder. "I'd heard that the princess took on a new student, but you're so young." She grinned playfully, rubbing a vigorous hoof into Sunset's mane. "You must be a really gifted little tyke, huh?" "Porcelain!" admonished Tea-Tray, practically jumping over to the pair, cleaning tools wobbling precariously in the process. She pulled the mare away, offering Sunset an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, Miss Shimmer. This is my little sister Porcelain Cup. She's just visiting today." She shot her sister a look of disapproval she usually reserved for the other maids whenever they broke something expensive. "And sometimes she has a distinct lack of manners." "I have manners," countered the Pegasus, hovering up in the air as she crossed her forelegs. "Sheesh, I was just complimenting her." She turned her head away. "And I'm a hit with foals. Just ask my daughter." "That's not an unbiased opinion, Porcelain," said Tea-Tray, her voice taking on a more teasing tone. Sunset brushed her now disheveled mane back into place with a hoof, glaring up at the mare that had dared to mess with it. She could have done without that particular compliment. And she certainly wasn't a tyke. She was 7. That made her a big pony, thank you very much. Still, she could see that Tea-Tray needed some help. Lighting up her horn, she began pushing the cart. Tea-Tray seemed like she wanted to protest, but relented. "Thank you, Miss Shimmer. I was headed down the hall and to the right." "What do you even need all this stuff for anyway?" asked Porcelain as she trotted beside them. "Seems like a bit much to me." "We've had a bit of a plumbing problem lately," replied Tea-Tray. "The other maids and I are helping with the cleanup." "Oh, yeah, I read about that this morning. Some sort of major disaster, huh? What caused it? Sunset glanced nervously between the two mares, her magical grip on the cart constricting. Celestia hadn't told any pony the exact cause of the disaster. She'd wanted to spare her student the embarrassment and negative attention. But there were those among the staff who could guess as to its origin, and Teetray was smart. A spell misfire, responded Teetray, repeating her employer's given explanation. Her eyes quickly glanced at Sunset. Ice got in the pipes. That's some misfire, commented Porcelain, thankfully not pressing the issue, nor noticing her sister's glance. Looking over at Sunset, the Pegasus let out a whistle. That's a whole lot of weight for a little thing like you to be pushing around. I can handle it, assured Sunset, moving further ahead to put some distance between them. After that first interaction, she wanted to be as far out of reach of this mare as possible. You know, my daughter's a unicorn, just like you, except she's only 4, continued Porcelain conversationally. I'd wanted a Pegasus so we could fly together, but that's what I get for marrying a unicorn. She gave a hearty laugh. I love her just the same, but I couldn't even imagine her being as strong as you are. She shuddered. Those magic surges were bad enough. How is Porcelain Figurine, anyway? Asked Teetray as the trio turned a corner. You'd see more of her if you took more time off, barked Porcelain. But she's just fine. I decided to give her swimming lessons just the other day. The Pegasus puffed out her chest. Took to it like a little fish. Really? Cooed Teetray. Sunset's jaw fell open. She can swim already? A 4-year-old unicorn had learned how to swim before her? But how? She'd been trying, and she was older. Yep, replied the proud Pegasus. A little early, but I love swimming myself. So does T. Though I'm sure a filly as talented as you can swim like a pro by now, she said, giving Sunset a wink. Yeah, of course I can. Her little hooves tripped on the rug, and her face was hurled toward the floor. Teetray caught her before she made impact. Are you okay, Miss Shimmer? She asked softly. I'm fine, Sunset answered, even though she felt anything but. I just tripped. You need to watch where you're going, kiddo. You can get really hurt that way, said Porcelain. Teetray eyed the cart. Maybe I should take some of that back. I've got it, insisted Sunset, trying her best to ignore the squeezing sensation from her ribs. Finally, the trio reached the room where Teetray was needed. Sunset let go of the cart, offering it to the other waiting maids. With a simple exchange of goodbyes, Sunset retreated to her room, shutting the door firmly behind her as she threw down her saddlebags. I got beaten by a 4-year-old? Sunset held back angry tears. She was a big pony, and big ponies didn't cry. But it wasn't fair. It just wasn't fair. Pulling out the assignments the princess had left for her, Sunset placed them on her desk. Maybe her homework would get her mind off of it. Levitating a quill to begin writing, she saw that the first thing on the pile was the swimmer's safety test. A new wave of misery washed over her, and rather than answer the questions, she simply flipped the page over. The unicorn crossed her forelegs on the desk, laying down her head. She didn't understand it. Why was this so hard? A 4-year-old had learned to swim easily, while she was still struggling. Princess Celestia expected her to learn how to swim, but every time Sunset tried, it always ended in failure, humiliation, or lectures, sometimes all 3. Lifting her head, she glanced down at the overturned test pinned beneath her forelegs. It was just facts and rules, something her agile mind would be able to handle with ease. She remembered Celestia's safety lecture yesterday from beginning to end. Or did she? An unfamiliar shadow of doubt crept over her, whispering its cold, cruel words in her ear. She'd screwed up at every other aspect of her swimming lessons, it said. So why not this one? What if she failed the test, too? But that was silly, she tried to argue. She'd aced every test and subject the princess put before her. Reading, math, spelling, history, and especially magic. She'd excelled at all of them. Sunset was a smart little filly. The princess and many other ponies had told her so. She studied hard, worked hard, and always came out on top. Always. But not swimming. I can't learn to swim at all. Even her attempt to get around it backfired, damaging the castle and giving Princess Celestia more work. Absent-mindedly, she allowed her quill to scribble over the back of the swimmer's safety test, not caring about whether Celestia would reprimand her for it later. Swimming equal failure. Failure, a word she thought she'd never hear connected to herself. But swimming was pure failure. Her quill kept writing, putting her thoughts to paper. I'm always going to fail. Why, just why, couldn't she stay afloat? The word repeated in her head like a broken record. Why? Then another thought popped into her head, hitting her with all the shock of a snowball to the face. Could it be that she wasn't smart at all? Were the princess and all those other ponies just being nice to her because she was an orphan now? Had she actually gotten everything wrong this whole time? After all, how could she call herself a smart filly when she couldn't even get down something easy like floating? Or what if she was just, what was that word she heard those adult ponies use once? Right, a fluke. What if she was just a fluke? What if all her success was just luck, and she started failing at everything else now, too? What if everything she did ended in another humiliating screw-up, another disaster? What if she damaged the castle even more? Hopelessness and fear dug their claws into her little heart, even as her quill transcribed another thought. I'm just a failure. Her gaze turned to the other assignments, a short vocabulary list, some math problems, and several advanced magical exercises and questions, all of them familiar. On any other day, she'd have tackled them immediately. Now just looking at them filled her with dread, with the certainty of failure and humiliation. Dropping her quill and flipping the safety test back over to return it to the stack, Sunset Shimmer got down from her chair before climbing into her very large bed and pulling the covers over her body. It was the only thing she felt like doing anymore. Celestia shut the door to her private chambers, her shoulders drooping. How is it that a meeting with the head avocado growers in Equestria can take so long? She asked aloud. Up on her perch, Philomena let out a shrill laugh, pointing a wing in her princess's direction. Oh, hush you, she told her companion. Keep that up, and next time I'll take you with me and lock your cage. The phoenix promptly fell silent, shaking her head violently. Satisfied that she'd silenced the peanut gallery, the princess retreated to a nearby sofa. I need to do something to get my mind off endless avocados. Perhaps she should check her students' progress? The deadline for the latest batch of assignments had been set for 2:30, and it was 3:45 now. Philomena, could you get the mailbag? The phoenix let out an annoyed squawk, clearly not happy at being made a mail carrier, but obliged anyway. It was a simple bag, not unlike a saddlebag. She used it to hold the various letters that got dropped at her door. And when she had students, it was also used to turn in assignments when Celestia was otherwise preoccupied. After the issue yesterday, Celestia had decided to switch tracks yet again to something less practical and more academic, and then threw in regular work for good measure. Technically, she'd wanted to go over swimmer safety after her student had learned how to swim, but one had to adapt in the face of adversity, and this certainly qualified. Opening up the bag and sifting through the contents, she found, to her great surprise, only normal letters. Philomena, she asked, turning to her companion, did you see Sunset deposit anything by the door today? The phoenix shook her head. That was certainly odd. She may not have been Celestia's pupil for very long, but the Alicorn knew Sunset didn't miss a deadline. I'd better go check on her. Walking over to Sunset's room, conveniently located down the same hall, she knocked on the door. Sunset? Are you in there? When no answer came, she knocked again. Sunset? Her ears picked up something through the wood, though she wasn't sure what. Opening the door, she stuck her head inside. Sunset? Celestia's gaze immediately fell on the bed, and the filly-shaped lump sticking out of it. Sunset? Asked the princess as she approached. Are you all right? Sunset turned to her other side, muttering something Celestia couldn't quite make out. Are you not feeling well? I noticed that you didn't turn in any of your assignments. Sunset mumbled again, louder this time, but Celestia still couldn't tell what she was actually saying. Pardon me? Sunset shot up from her bed, glaring angrily. I said they're on my desk. Here! She levitated a stack of papers, pushing them towards Celestia. The princess flipped through the pages, The swimmer's safety test was blank, completely unmarked. All of the other assignments were just the same. Her face turned to one of stern disapproval. Sunset Shimmer, why are these blank? You were told to finish this test and all of these assignments almost 2 hours ago. Because I didn't want to do them, Sunset muttered angrily. I didn't want to do the swimming test. I didn't want to do any of them! Eyes turned downwards towards her sheets. Sunset dropped back onto her mattress, pulling the covers over her head. So I guess I get an F, she muttered sadly. A big fat F for everything. If you're feeling ill, I can fetch the doctor, Celestia suggested, her tone softening as worry pricked at her heart. What had gotten into her? Had she been like this since this morning? Now the princess wished she hadn't needed the early breakfast. Had Sunset even eaten breakfast? Or lunch? Or left this room? If she'd been like this all day, then she might not have. There was a small grumble from the bed, and Celestia chose her next question carefully. Sunset, have you eaten lunch today? Another grumble. No. 3:45 and she still hadn't eaten lunch? That wasn't a good sign. Did you come down for breakfast? Yes. Well, at least she'd eaten something. It was a tiny island of relief in a growing sea of worry. I can have something sent here if you would rather stay in bed. I want to be alone, muttered Sunset, her little voice radiating misery. Please, princess, leave me alone. Celestia wanted to do anything but that. However, she knew that forcing the issue wasn't likely to improve her student's mood. She took a few steps back. All right, Sunset, I'll leave you alone. But please remember to eat something, all right? She didn't get an answer, but left anyway, taking the undone work with her. She had a feeling that if she'd left it, it might have ended up shredded. On the way back to her room, she stopped a passing guard. Tell the chef to have something sent to Sunset Shimmer's room. She's not feeling well, so make it something plain, but not warm, so she can eat it when she wants. The guard saluted and went on his way, and Celestia returned to the privacy of her own rooms. Philomena still sat in her usual place, preening one of her wings. What's wrong with her? Celestia asked. She looked at the stack of papers again, and stopped. There was the shadow of writing on the back of the test. Turning the document over, she read the scribbled words. Her heart sank. Oh, Sunset. She sighed, allowing herself to pace around the room. After the first day's disaster, it became clear to her that Sunset was afraid of drowning, no doubt from her own experiences. That fear was causing her to automatically panic whenever she started to descend beneath the surface. Celestia had been certain she'd be able to help Sunset get past it eventually. Once Sunset cleared that hurdle, she would be swimming with the best of ponies. Except now, that fear had transformed into depression and doubt, and it was eating away at the poor filly's sense of self-esteem. True, Sunset had seemed rather despondent after the floating exercises, but not like this. Had Celestia missed something? Whatever she'd missed, it didn't change the fact that she needed to solve this, and fast. Sunset wouldn't even officially start at CSGU until the new school year began in August. But if she kept up this attitude, it was all but a lost cause. Frustration shot through Celestia's limbs. Why couldn't she teach her student how to swim? It was her responsibility, and yet she found herself at a roadblock. No, it was worse than a roadblock. Celestia had wanted her student to be safe and unafraid around water. Instead, the Alicorn's efforts had somehow backfired and left Sunset unwilling to apply herself to her studies, the very antithesis of a teacher's sacred duty. The princess continued to pace, wings twitching at her sides as she turned the problem over in her head. She and her sister had learned to swim easily over a millennium before. Often they'd raced each other in lakes and rivers. By their teenage years, Luna had come to beat Celestia more times than not. Loneliness stabbed at her chest. Luna. There was a knock at the door. Princess, said a unicorn maid, bearing a rolling cart in her magic. I brought you some tea. She took a step back at Celestia's stormy expression. Should I come back later? No, it's fine, Celestia replied, putting on a pleasant smile as she lifted the teapot and cups from the cart. I'll take it, Thank you. The maid departed, and Celestia sat down on the sofa, pouring out a cup, admiring the floral scent before taking a sip. The tea was just what she needed, calm retaking her mind. Now was not the time to give in to frustration. Now was the time for planning. This problem needed to be solved, and her students' spirits lifted before any greater, or worse, lasting harm was done. Logically, she knew Sunset must have understood the motions of swimming by now. Her attempts, failed as they were, showed that she was able to mimic Celestia's leg movements in the water. There was some unfamiliarity to them, but that would be fixed with time. Not that it mattered much at present. The automatic panic response made all of those practiced motions disappear. Celestia picked the test back up, looking again at the words Sunset had written. I'm always going to fail. I'm just a failure. A disturbingly defeatist statement for one so young, especially for a filly like Sunset. She couldn't let her go on thinking like that. There had to be some way to resolve this, some method that would allow her student to swim, and more importantly, overcome this mental and emotional obstacle. And then Celestia had an idea. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to fix this after all. Would you like more salad? Sunset Shimmer looked away from her book, a children's novel filled with knights and adventure. No, thank you, she muttered. Today, the pair found themselves on a picnic by the shore of a rather lonely lake. A change of scenery, the princess had said. Personally, Sunset hadn't felt like going anywhere, let alone on a picnic near a body of water. But Celestia wouldn't take no for an answer. You need to stop sulking. A little sunshine will do you good, the princess had said, as she'd basically hauled the filly from her bed, barely giving Sunset time to pick a book to take along. Celestia stretched her long legs, inhaling the mountain air. I think this picnic was a wonderful idea. Don't you? Yeah, replied Sunset with general disinterest. The sunshine was nice, and the umbrella Celestia brought along provided some protection from the heat. But misery still clung to her like a steel chain, and the sight of the lake didn't help matters. The princess got to her hooves. I'm going to go for a swim. Would you like to join me? Sunset looked up from her book, giving her teacher a flat expression. I don't want to get bitten by another fish. Oh, I thought of that already, replied Celestia airily. I took the liberty of temporarily moving all the fauna in the lake, so it's completely empty. You don't even have to practice, Sunset. You could just use the flotation ring. Celestia reached into the bag she'd brought, but came up empty-hooved. Oh, dear, said the princess, face falling. I must have forgotten it at the castle. Sunset turned the page. I'll just stay here and read. If that's what you want. Celestia trotted off to the lake shore before wading into the water. Sunset watched her go. The crystal-clear water shimmered in the sunlight. Celestia's strokes were slow but strong as she moved to the middle of the lake. She grimaced. Princess Celestia made it seem so easy. I hate swimming, whined Sunset as she curled up in the shade of the umbrella. And most especially, she hated swimming lessons. They weren't even lessons. Lessons implied some form of learning was happening, and there wasn't. Only failure. Breathing a heavy sigh, Sunset turned her attention back to her mentor. She was swimming along as gracefully as ever, something Sunset could never do. The princess waved at her, and Sunset waved half-heartedly back. Feeling a drop of sweat on her back, she put the book aside and laid her head down on the blanket. A nice nap in the shade sounded good to her right now. She closed her eyes, feeling a heaviness begin to overtake them. Just a little bit longer. She wanted to stay in the shade a little bit longer. A sharp cry ripped Sunset from her trip to dreamland. Her head shot up, zeroing in on the lake. Celestia was flailing in the water. Some sort of green, slimy vine was wrapping itself around her neck. Sunset! Sunset, go get help! Celestia's words were cut off when a vine coiled itself around her mouth. Princess! Sunset jumped to her hooves, her eyes darting around for the guards. Where were they? They were always supposed to be nearby, and the princess was in danger. Why weren't they swooping in? Her body danced with panic. That's right. When they were in the gardens, Sunset had been so embarrassed at the thought of every pony finding out she couldn't swim that she'd asked Celestia to send the guards away and keep her lessons private.
The princess must have done that again, without telling her. That's why she'd picked such a remote lake. They were completely alone. What could she do? She couldn't teleport yet, and it was too far to run. She saw Celestia's forelegs flail again as the vines tightened, dragging the alicorn under the water. No! In a moment of pure impulse, she galloped toward the lake shore, diving headlong into the water. Little legs pushed her forward. She had to reach Celestia. Forcing her eyes open and ignoring the discomfort, she managed to spot her mentor struggling just under the surface of the water. She was caught in the grasp of some kind of plant-looking thing with tons of tentacle-like vines, each constricting tightly around Celestia's torso, legs, and wings. The tentacles were attached to some kind of large central mass. Sunset could see a pair of weirdly shaped white eyes and a deformed mouth that opened and closed like a fish as it drew Celestia ever closer. Celestia said that she'd moved all the creatures in the lake. How had this thing gotten missed? What even was it? Well, whatever it was, Sunset wasn't going to let it hurt her teacher. Pushing her head up to the surface for just a moment, she gulped down on fresh air before diving again. Charging her horn, she fired off a beam of magic, aiming for the base of the tentacle that had ensnared her teacher's wing. Her shot sliced right through it, and the stump writhed with agony. Sunset kept firing, severing each vine with a virtual bombardment of cyan energy.
Get away! Get away! Get away from her! Take that! And that!
When the last one finally broke, the central mass pulled back, and Celestia pushed herself to the surface.
Princess, are you okay?
Shouted Sunset as she and Celestia made it back to the lake shore. I'm fine, my faithful student, said Celestia as she shook some of the excess water from her coat. You were incredibly brave.
What was that thing?
The filly asked, turning wary eyes back to the water.
I thought you moved all the things in the lake. Is it some kind of monster? What if it tries to get us again? What if... Ah!
She recoiled as the vegetable monster lifted itself out of the water, crawling slowly onto the shore.
Princess! It's back! It's... Huh?
The vegetable mass looked less intimidating in the sun. It was indeed a mass, a giant lump of seaweed with several now significantly shorter pieces that were braided together like ropes. The eyes she'd seen were nothing but a pair of clams, while the mouth was made of seashells. It looked about as inanimate as you could get. But she'd definitely seen it move. Carefully, Sunset approached it.
Hey!
She narrowed her eyes as she peered closer.
Why is it glowing?
Indeed, the entire creature was wrapped in a golden light. A light that looked a lot like... The filly turned back around, just in time to see Celestia's horn aglow with magic. Sunset stared at the alicorn in shock.
You tricked me?
Shock quickly transitioned to anger, and Sunset glared menacingly at her teacher, or as much as possible for a filly her age.
That was mean! You told me your pranks never turn mean!
I'm sorry, Sunset, but I felt I had little choice. She set down the now useless puppet, letting it hit the ground with a wet plop. Not that it detracts from the bravery you just displayed. The filly's cheeks flushed at the praise, but she wouldn't allow herself to be distracted.
Why did you do that?
She asked, huge cyan eyes staring up at Celestia like she was searching for the answer to the universe. The alicorn gave her a sly grin. Sunset, do you realize what you did just now? Sunset paused, brain stalling as she remembered everything she'd done when she'd seen the monster.
I swam! She declared brightly. I swam!
The little filly bounced up and down.
I was really swimming! I did it!
Celestia laughed, using a hoof to hold the filly to the ground. Yes, you did, my little pony. You swam all by yourself.
But why couldn't I do it before? Asked Sunset. I was trying so hard, and yesterday...
Celestia angled her neck lower. What happened?
Yesterday, T-Tray's sister came by. Her daughter just learned to swim, answered Sunset,
shuffling her hooves as she remembered the unhappy revelation.
She's only 4, and she got it right away.
The princess nodded in understanding. That must have been very hard to hear. Sunset's gaze moved to the ground.
I thought that maybe I was stupid,
or that I was just a fluke. You are most certainly not Sunset Shimmer, assured Celestia, sounding almost offended at the idea of associating such words with the unicorn. You are an extremely bright filly, and one I am very happy to have as my personal student. Her tone turned especially gentle. Part of the problem was that you were afraid. You had every right to be afraid, Sunset, but that fear was causing you to panic at the slightest provocation. And as you kept having problems, you convinced yourself that you'd never succeed. Sunset had gotten pretty scared during her lessons, her most recent attempts at floating coming to mind. Even still, questions buzzed around in her head. Had that really been all there was to it?
I've never had problems learning the stuff you teach me before.
There may be some subjects that may not come as easily to you as others, Sunset. But just because that happens doesn't mean you are suddenly stupid or a fluke. The princess's face flushed ever so slightly. And I think I was part of the reason for your struggles. Believe it or not, I've never taught any pony to swim before, so perhaps my approach was not the best. Sunset's eyes widened in disbelief.
Really? Not ever?
Really. In all honesty, it might have been better if I'd simply hired a swimming instructor for you. A white wing wrapped itself around the unicorn. What I want you to remember is this, Sunset Shimmer. I believe that you can and will pass any challenge I set before you, whether it's immediately or takes time. You simply need to have confidence. If you don't believe in yourself, how do you expect to accomplish anything? The touch of damp feathers made Sunset shiver, but only a little.
Why did you trick me?
She asked, still a little hurt. I could see that you knew how to swim. You just needed a little push to get past all your fears and doubts. I'd considered faking a cramp, but I wasn't sure how believable that would be. She pointed at the seaweed mass. That's why I had this prepared. I truly am sorry for the distress it caused you.
But what if I didn't do it?
Asked the filly, looking over at the prop. Drying out in the daylight, the thing that had been so frightening a few minutes ago just looked pathetic now.
What if I failed again?
Celestia gave her a knowing smile. I simply knew that you would, my little pony. I had confidence that, when you felt you needed to, you would be able to do it. The words made Sunset feel warm inside. The unicorn moved closer to give her teacher a hug, not even bothered by Celestia's wet fur pressing against her own.
Thank you, Princess.
The white alicorn returned the gesture. You're very welcome. They spent a moment in silence, just looking out at the hills surrounding Canterlot, at the lake, water still once again and shining beautifully in the afternoon sun.
Princess Celestia?
Asked Sunset quietly, shattering the moment.
Do you think if I learned to swim earlier, I could have stayed with my parents?
Celestia's gaze remained fixed on the lake, but Sunset could see a dark shadow falling over her eyes. For several seconds, the silence resumed. Maybe, but it's not healthy to linger on those kinds of thoughts. What if and what could have been? Her voice turned somber. They can easily become an obsession. The princess looked down at her, eyes filled with sympathy. So please, try not to think about it. All right, my student? Sunset nodded her head. Okay. In an instant, the princess's face snapped into one of pure business. Now, Sunset, just because you've proven to both of us that you can swim doesn't mean you're excused from practicing. Exercises will help your muscles improve. I want you to be able to swim without a crisis for motivation. For once, the thought of swimming didn't fill the little unicorn with dread.
Yes, Princess Celestia.
And I also expect you to retake the swimmer's safety test, added the princess with a stern edge. It's vitally important for a pony as young as yourself to understand those rules. I won't be letting you near another body of water until you pass. Do I make myself clear? Sunset winced, cheeks reddening at the memory of yesterday. She'd actually skipped her assignments and yelled at Celestia to boot.
I'm sorry.
Celestia softened. I can't say I blame you, considering the mood you were in, but you still need to finish it, along with the other assignments I gave you. I'm making an allowance this time, but in the future, I don't want you thinking you can shirk your assignment simply because you don't feel like it. The filly bowed her head, trying and failing to hide among Celestia's feathers.
Yes, Princess Celestia.
Good. The alicorn smiled. Now, I think we should get back to enjoying this picnic in earnest. Getting up, she walked back under the shade of the umbrella, opening the lid of the tremendous basket. I think I see a few slices of chocolate cake in here. Sunset bolted to her hooves.
Save some for me!
And that's the end of Swimming Lessons Chapter 2. There's only an epilogue left, which will be up soon. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. Wow, this took a long time to record, not just because it's long, but because I think I screwed up at I did screw up at one of the voices early in the recording, so I had to redo it. Very frustrating. And if you like this video, if you have liked this reading, please remember to do things like press that subscribe button if you haven't already, or press that like button, or leave a comment. Tell me how I'm doing. Did you like this story? What did you like about it? Anything. Or if there was a problem, tell me. I can't get better unless somebody says something. Or you can also check out some of the other videos that I've done, the readings, although there aren't very many of them so far, or all the other things that I've done over the years. And you could do any of one of those things or all of them. Every little bit helps to fight the YouTube algorithm. So please consider doing that. It really helps, and it would really make a difference. And I'll see you guys next time with the epilogue to Swimming Lessons. Unless I post something else in between that. I don't think I will, but whatever. Well, you'll find out. Bye.